Today we'll be looking at the causes of the American Revolution. So we will be starting Unit 1, and these are notes number 1. So the 13 colonies. So we're going to kind of like jump right into the U.S. in the colonial phase. So these colonies are all under British rule. And so they're separated by region because they have some kind of regional differences. So you have the New England colonies in the north, which are Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. And the southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And so these colonies, based on their regions, have some differences that influences their economies and perspectives of the people. For instance, the New England colonies, their economy is built much more around shipbuilding. They have lush forests, so they have lumber. The middle colony is known for its fertile soil. So you see a lot more farming done within that region. And then in the south, they also have a lot of crops, but they produce more cash crops versus the middle colonies producing actual like food items. And so in the South, we see tobacco, we see rice, indigo, and eventually cotton will become a popular cash crop for them. The role of the colony. So the main purpose of the colonial system was to enrich Britain. Britain looked to its American colonies as a market for British goods, a source of raw materials that were not native to Britain, and as a producer of goods and materials to be sold to other nations. So colonies are territories. So the American colonies are territories of Great Britain, and the whole purpose of that is to produce wealth to Great Britain, whether it's for them to sell items to the colonists or for them to gain resources from their land. However, the American colonists began to export their goods to other countries like Spain, France, and Holland. Britain viewed the colonists' pursuit of foreign markets as an economic threat, so they didn't necessarily want them um, to be sending, sharing their resources or trade with other people. They wanted them to be exclusive to them. As a result, Britain passed the Navigation Acts, a series of laws restricting colonial trade. This system would benefit Britain, but it also did prove to be good for the colonists as well. So the Navigation Acts, what they established was that no country could trade with the colonies unless the goods were shipped in either colonial or English ships. All vessels had to be operated by crews that were at least three-quarters English or colonial. The colonies could export certain products to England, and almost all goods traded between the colonies and Europe first had to pass through an English port. So they're just trying to restrict the colonies' abilities to include other countries. They want to exclusively trade with them, and they didn't want the colonies to trade with anyone else. Tensions emerged. A number of colonial merchants resented the trade restrictions. Many continued to smuggle goods or trade illegally. The leaders and merchants of Massachusetts were top offenders. Britain revoked their corporate charter, and Massachusetts became a royal colony under strict control of the crown. Seeds of self-government. Every colony had a governor appointed by the king who served as the highest authority. The governor would oversee a political structure that included an advisory council and local assembly elected by eligible colonials. The colonies were beginning to develop a taste for self-government that would eventually create conditions for rebellion. So they liked the idea of being able to control themselves, elect someone, a representative within themselves who could oversee. They didn't like the idea of someone else telling them what to do. Impact from the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War ended in 1763, with Britain claiming all of North America east of the Mississippi River. By this time, tensions between Britain and Massachusetts had been increasing. British custom officials began to search colonial homes. The British government stationed 10,000 troops in its territories. The colonists worried that the standing army might turn against them. And so this was something that you saw in the little clip from America, the Story of Us. that the colonists really didn't like having this foreign army present within their towns. They felt very threatened by them. Britain had borrowed so much money during the war that it had nearly doubled its national debt. In 1764, the English Parliament issued the Sugar Act in an effort to combat their debt. Among other things, it made smuggling a more severe crime. By the end of 1764, the colonists and Britain were disagreeing on more and more about how they should be taxed and governed. So let's stop and think. How did the French and Indian War change the American colonies? So if we look at the two pictures here, we see that once the war is done, Great Britain, their area is seen in purple, has a greater control over the region. So they have more control, but that came at a cost. So they spent a lot of money to get this land. And so we're going to start to see that Britain wants the colonists to basically, help to repay them back, help to get them out of debt. The colonies organized to resist. In order to finance debts from the French and Indian War, Parliament had turned its attention to the resources of the colonies. The Stamp Act was passed in March of 1765. It required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for every legal document, license, newspaper, pamphlet, and almanac. The Sons of Liberty began harassing custom workers and stamp agents. So the Sons of Liberty were kind of an early revolutionary rebellion type group that kind of questioned and openly rebelled against British authority. Stamp agents across the colonies began to resign. The Boston Massacre. The presence of British soldiers in Boston streets charged the air with hostility. The city soon erupted in clashes between British soldiers and colonists. One such attack was labeled as the Boston Massacre by Samuel Adams. This presented it as a British attack against defenseless citizens. And so this was also something we saw in the America, the Story of Us clip, where I believe it was 11 colonists were killed. The story spread across the colonies, was shared with this kind of depiction right here. And so it really helped to kind of change people's opinions, lead them to question what the British are doing. The Boston Tea Party. Colonists protested a new tea act that would cut colonial tea merchants out of the tea trade. In late 1773, a large group of Boston rebels disguised themselves as Native Americans and took action against 3 British tea ships. They dumped 18,000 pounds of tea into the Boston harbor, and this became known as the Boston Tea Party. So by dumping that all into the harbor, that tea is not good anymore. I believe the amount that they said in America's Story of Us was $1 million worth of tea. So those British companies just lost all of that money. So that is going to make them very upset. So let's stop and think. What did the colonists have to be upset about? So things leading up to the Declaration of Independence and the start of the American Revolution. We have the Stamp Act. We're starting to see excessive and unnecessary taxes imposed on the colonists. Their biggest concern and biggest complaint is that there is no one in Parliament to represent them and to speak for them. We also see that more troops are coming into the colonies. You're starting to get more tensions between the troops and the colonists that lead to events like the Boston Massacre. They feel that they're being restricted in terms of their trade and who they can trade with. So you just have a lot of kind of little events kind of adding up. The fighting begins. The First Continental Congress met in September of 1774 in Philadelphia to create a Declaration of Colonial Rights. They defended the colonies' rights to run their own affairs. They also agreed to meet again in 1775 if their demands were not met. After this meeting, many eastern towns stepped up military preparations. Minutemen were civilian soldiers, so these were colonists that began to join the fight. Sometimes they're also referred to as militia members. The British General Gage heard rumors of Minutemen prepping and gathering large amounts of weapons. Gage intended to march his troops to Concord by way of Lexington and seize the leaders of the resistance and destroy all hidden weapons. The leaders of the resistance were tipped off to the arrival of the British and were able to prepare. The Battle of Lexington was the first conflict between the British and the colonists, with the element of surprise on their side. The colonists were able to do damage to the British Army. The colonists hover between peace and war. In May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress met to discuss their next move. Conflicts between British soldiers and Minutemen were still happening. John Adams proposed that each colony set up their own government and for Congress to declare them independent. He also wanted the Minutemen to be recognized as the Continental Army. George Washington would be put in charge. By early summer 1776, the Congress appointed a committee to prepare a formal declaration explaining the reasons for colonies wanting independence. Thomas Jefferson was chosen to write this declaration. The Declaration of Independence drew on concepts from John Locke, so these Enlightenment ideals like natural rights. The American colonies used this document to declare their independence from Britain and list the ways the British king had violated the unalienable rights of Americans. And this idea that all men should be created equal. And so we will be looking at the Declaration of Independence in class. On July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted by Congress. Patriot and Loyalist. American colonists now faced the bitter choice: revolution or loyalty to the crown. Those who were supporters of independence became known as patriots. Patriots drew their numbers from people who saw an economic opportunity in an independent America. Quakers supported the patriots but did not fight because they did not believe in war. Loyalists. These were Americans who opposed independence and remained loyal to the crown. Many Loyalist sympathizers changed sides as the war progressed. Some Loyalists felt a special tie to the king and supported him because they thought the British would win and didn't want to be punished as rebels. Many Native Americans supported the British because they viewed the colonial settlers as a bigger threat. So right now we just went over kind of a lot of these causes and tensions that will lead up to the Revolutionary War. We're now facing, the colonists who are wanting to gain independence from Great Britain. Great Britain is an established world power, so they have a very strong army who will now be fighting against American colonists that are just kind of, these Minutemen and militias have been put and pieced together. So they definitely are considered the underdog. So next week we'll talk more about the outcomes of the revolution and how these colonists will eventually establish their own government.